When a grieving Marine was attacked by police after his son's funeral, 7 fellow Marines showed up to defend him. What happened next shook the entire community. If you love our stories, hit subscribe and tell us where in the world you're watching from. The cool evening breeze whispered softly through the towering pines of Evergreen Memorial Cemetery, rustling the delicate petals of fresh lilies that lay scattered across the newly turned soil. The sun had long dipped below the horizon, leaving behind a pale indigo sky streaked with the fading remnants of daylight. Streetlights flickered on one by one along the distant main road, casting faint glows that barely reached the far edge of the cemetery grounds. Master Gunnery Sergeant Frank Delaney stood alone, motionless, beside his son's grave. He had been standing there for hours, barely aware of the passing time, lost in a fog of grief so dense that the world around him felt both distant and irrelevant. His once broad shoulders, though still carried with an air of military precision, had stooped ever so slightly beneath the invisible weight that pressed upon him. The navy blue suit he wore fit a little looser now than it had years ago, the fabric clinging gently to a frame that age had quietly diminished. A small American flag pin gleamed on his lapel, catching the sparse light and glinting like a quiet symbol of the life he had lived and the values he had never abandoned. The headstone before him was simple, elegant in its restraint. It read, Daniel Michael Delaney, beloved son, firefighter, hero. Beneath it, the words, Asterisk, greater love hath no man than this, that a man laid down his life for his friends. Asterisk, Frank's weathered hands trembled slightly as he reached out to adjust the arrangement of white lilies resting against the base of the grave marker. His fingertips brushed the cool granite, tracing the etched letters as if reaffirming the painful reality before him. The chill of the evening deepened, yet Frank remained unmoved. His lips moved in soft whispers, fragmented conversations with his son that no one else could hear. He spoke of memories they shared, of baseball games played in the park, of camping trips beneath the stars, of the pride he felt when Daniel had pinned on his firefighter's badge. His voice wavered, sometimes cracking, but never faltering completely. This was his vigil, his final act of presence for a son taken too soon. In the distance, the faint sound of tires crunching over gravel broke the stillness. The headlights of a patrol car cut through the growing darkness, slowly winding its way along the cemetery's narrow lane. Frank barely noticed. The vehicle came to a stop several yards away, its engine idling quietly. A moment later, the driver's door opened, and a young officer stepped out, his polished boots clicking softly on the paved walkway. Officer Kyle Henderson adjusted his belt as he approached, the faint glow from his flashlight casting long shadows that danced across the grave markers. His uniform was crisp, his posture rigid with the kind of confidence that often accompanies youth and inexperience. His hand rested casually near his holstered weapon, more out of habit than necessity, though the gesture subtly conveyed his readiness to assert authority. He stopped a few feet behind Frank, observing the older man for a moment. The scene before him didn't match the mental image he had formed when dispatch reported a possible trespasser on restricted property. The man standing there was not some vagrant or mischievous youth, but a sharply dressed elderly gentleman, unmoving, silently communing with the grave. Still, rules were rules. Officer Henderson cleared his throat. Sir. Frank did not respond, his eyes remaining fixed on the headstone. The officer took a step closer. Sir, I need to speak with you. Slowly, as though emerging from a distant dream, Frank turned his head slightly, finally acknowledging the presence behind him. His eyes, reddened and glassy, met the officer's with a hollow, pained expression. I'm sorry to disturb you, sir, Henderson began, his tone polite but firm, but the cemetery closed at sunset. You're currently trespassing on restricted property. Frank blinked, as if trying to fully comprehend the words. I've just been talking to my son, he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. I didn't realize how late it had gotten. I understand, sir. Truly, Henderson replied, though his voice lacked the weight of genuine empathy. But it's after hours, and I have to ask you to leave. Frank turned back to the grave, placing a steadying hand once more on the headstone. Just a few more minutes. Please. Henderson shifted uncomfortably, glancing down at his watch. His training had emphasized maintaining control of encounters, ensuring compliance with regulations. Exceptions were rarely discussed. "Sir, I really do need you to comply," he said, his voice tightening slightly. "If you refuse to leave, I'll have no choice but to take further action." Frank exhaled, a long, trembling breath escaping his chest. The wind picked up, carrying with a faint scent of damp earth and cut grass. The world around him seemed to narrow, as if the only thing anchoring him to reality was a slab of granite before him. "I buried my boy today," Frank whispered. "He saved lives, ran into a burning building, never came back out." For a moment, Henderson hesitated, the weight of the man's words pressing against his sense of duty. But procedure clawed its way back to the forefront of his mind. "I'm sorry for your loss, sir," he said, voice more clipped now. "But you're still trespassing. Please step away from the grave and follow me to the car." Frank didn't move. His silence was not defiance, but rather a quiet refusal to abandon the moment. Officer Henderson's hand moved to his radio. "Dispatch. I have a non-compliant individual at Evergreen Memorial requesting backup." A crackle of static replied, followed by an acknowledgement. The officer returned his gaze to Frank. "Sir, this is your last warning." Still, Frank remained rooted in place, his hand gently resting on his son's name as if the connection might somehow keep Daniel close for just a few moments longer. The cemetery lights flickered softly in the distance. The only sound was a whispering wind and the quiet murmur of leaves above. The world stood still, balanced precariously between grief and authority, as the patrol car's distant backup lights began to approach. The soft of the patrol car's approaching engine blended with the distant rustle of leaves, but Frank barely heard it. His mind drifted, carried away from the cold ground beneath his feet and back to the long corridors of his memory, where the weight of years sat heavy. He had lived a life defined by duty. Frank Delaney had been only 17 when he first raised his right hand and swore the oath. The Marines became his family, his discipline, his identity. His drill instructor's voice still echoed in his mind sometimes. Sharp commands, endless repetitions, the relentless pursuit of perfection. The Corps taught him to stand straight, to endure, to push beyond what seemed possible. He wore the uniform with pride, the globe and anchor gleaming on his chest. Through 25 years of service, Frank had seen parts of the world most would never know, and some he would have gladly forgotten. Desert sands that stretched endlessly beneath a searing sun. Dense jungles where every step carried unseen dangers. Dark nights spent huddled in forward operating bases, listening to distant gunfire and praying that morning would come without casualties. His hands had carried rifles, his voice had barked orders, and his heart had steeled itself against fear. He led men into battle. Some returned home, others did not. The medals that now sat inside a plain wooden box at home, ribbons for valor, for leadership, for sacrifice, were reminders of what had been given and what had been lost. Yet, for all their shine, none of them filled the emptiness that lingered after the deployments ended. When he finally hung up his uniform, the world felt quieter, but no less demanding. Frank had settled into civilian life with the same sense of discipline that guided his years in uniform. He became a mechanic, a trade that, while humble, brought honest work and steady pay. The local garage offered a small corner of stability, the steady rhythm of engines humming beneath his hands, metal and grease replacing the weapons of his past. But no duty was more important than the one waiting for him at home. 20 years ago, cancer had stolen his wife, Ellen. The memory of her soft laughter, the way her hand fit perfectly in his, and her fierce love for their little family remained etched in his soul. Her absence left a hollow that never quite healed. He had buried his grief quietly, turning his full attention to the boy they had raised together, Daniel. From the moment Daniel was born, Frank had found a new mission. He was no longer just a Marine or a mechanic. He was a father. Every bedtime story, every scrape knee, every school recital became his battlefield. He poured every lesson he knew into his son: integrity, responsibility, resilience. He taught Daniel how to throw a baseball, how to tie a proper knot, how to stand tall even when life tried to knock him down. Daniel grew quickly, too quickly it often seemed, and as the years passed, Frank watched with pride as his son found his own calling. It wasn't the Marines. Daniel had chosen a different kind of service. He had joined the fire department. Frank remembered the day Daniel received his badge. The ceremony had been modest, held inside the firehouse with a scent of smoke and diesel hung in the air. Frank had stood in the back, chest swelling with pride as his son shook hands with the fire chief, his smile wide and uncontainable. "I want to save lives, Dad," Daniel had said that night over dinner. "Like you did, only different." And he had. For years, Daniel ran into burning buildings when others ran out. He pulled strangers from wreckage, comforted terrified children, and stood as a quiet guardian in the face of danger. His courage was not loud or boastful. It was steady, unwavering. Frank never stopped worrying. Every alarm, every siren he heard in town made his stomach twist with dread. But he knew his son had found his purpose, and that gave him strength. Then came the call. It had been only a week ago, a cold, clear morning when Frank's phone rang just after dawn. The voice on the other end was calm, but heavy. There was a fire at the warehouse off Route 12. Your son was inside. Frank's heart sank even before the words finished. He rushed to the scene, only to find flashing lights, thick plumes of smoke rising into the sky, and firefighters standing in solemn clusters. The chief approached him with tears in his eyes. He went back in to get 2 workers who were trapped, the chief explained. He got them out, Frank, but the roof, it collapsed before he could make it back. Frank didn't hear much after that. The funeral followed days later. Full honors, fellow firefighters in dress uniform. The mayor gave a speech, but Frank barely absorbed it. The only thing that mattered was a flag-draped coffin, the sound of bagpipes filling the air, and the empty chair beside him where Ellen should have sat. And now here he stood, alone before the grave. The sound of gravel crunching underfoot pulled him slightly back to the present. Officer Henderson remained a respectful distance behind him, his stance more relaxed now, though the tension of duty still lingered in his eyes. Frank whispered softly to the headstone, as if Daniel could hear him through the cool night air. "You were braver than I ever was, son." The wind answered with a gentle sigh, carrying the faint scent of pine through the cemetery. The American flag planted beside Daniel's grave flapped gently, its colors vivid against the dark earth. Frank's fingers traced the engraved letters once more, as though drawing strength from his son's name. A father's pride mingled with unbearable sorrow. His whole life had been built around service, to his country, to his family, to his son. And now, all he could do was stand here at this grave and hope that somewhere, somehow, Daniel knew how proud he had always been. The world around him faded once again into stillness. The faint hum of the patrol car's engine idled softly in the distance, waiting. The air grew colder as the night deepened, the stars blinking softly above like distant witnesses to the quiet grief unfolding below. Frank remained still, his hand gently resting on the headstone, whispering to his son, as though Daniel might somehow hear him through the thin veil that now separated them. "I'm trying, son," Frank murmured, his voice low and hoarse. "Trying to be strong, like I taught you, but it's hard, harder than I ever imagined." His fingers trembled slightly, tracing the smooth edges of Daniel's name. The silence of the cemetery was both comforting and crushing, wrapping him in a solitude that allowed him to speak freely, yet offered no answers in return. The world had shrunk to this one small plot of earth, this single stone marker, and the heavy presence of loss. He had been standing here for hours, lost in conversation with his memories, unaware of how much time had passed since the funeral earlier that morning. The stream of visitors had long since left, offering their condolences, their hugs, their kind but empty words. Frank had remained rooted to the spot as daylight faded into dusk and then surrendered fully to the night. Officer Henderson stood a short distance behind him, his patience beginning to fray. The rookie cop shifted his weight from one foot to the other, glancing nervously at his watch. His training had taught him how to handle non-compliant civilians, but nothing about grieving fathers who had buried their only child mere hours before. "Sir," Henderson called out again, his voice firmer now. "The cemetery has been closed for over an hour. I need you to leave." Frank exhaled a long breath, closed his eyes for a moment. The words pulled him reluctantly back to the present, forcing him to face the young man standing behind him, badge gleaming under the dim moonlight. "I didn't realize how late it was," Frank said softly, turning slightly toward the officer. His face was lined with exhaustion, eyes red-rimmed from hours of quiet tears. I just needed some time. I understand, sir, Henderson replied, though the tension in his voice betrayed his discomfort. But you've already been here far past the allowed hours. I've been patient, but you're trespassing on restricted property now. Frank swallowed hard, his throat dry. Please, just a few more minutes. That's all I ask. Henderson's jaw tightened. The situation was growing more complicated than he was trained to handle. He had expected a simple encounter, a polite reminder, a quick compliance, and then on to the next patrol. Instead, he found himself facing a man drowning in sorrow, who saw this small request not as a violation, but as a lifeline. Sir, you've already had several hours, Henderson said, keeping his tone as professional as he could. Rules are rules. If I let you stay, then I'd have to allow it for everyone. That's not how this works. Frank's eyes glistened under the faint moonlight. His voice cracked as he spoke again. He was my son, my only son. I buried him today. His breath caught in his throat. Do you have children, officer? Henderson hesitated, the question striking deeper than he expected. No, sir, he replied quietly. Then you don't understand, Frank whispered, his voice barely audible. The silence between them thickened, the soft rustle of tree branches and distant hum of passing traffic, the only sounds filling the void. Henderson shifted again, his hand instinctively brushing against the radio clipped to his shoulder. He didn't want this to escalate, but policy was policy. Rules were rules. His sergeant had drilled that into him during training. I'm sorry, sir, Henderson said again, more firmly this time. But if you refuse to leave, I'll have no choice but to call for backup. Frank's shoulders sagged slightly, but he didn't move away from the grave. The thought of walking away, even for the night, felt unbearable. Leaving meant finality. It meant stepping back into a world that had become foreign, colder without his son's laughter, his voice, his presence. I just need to say good night, Frank whispered, his voice breaking. One more time. Henderson looked at the older man, his military posture still evident even in his grief, the hard lines of discipline softened by unimaginable sorrow. For a brief moment, the officer's resolve wavered, but the clock was ticking. His job was not to make exceptions. It was to enforce the law. With a quiet sigh, Henderson reached up and pressed a button on his radio. Dispatch! This is Officer Henderson at Evergreen Memorial. I have an individual refusing to vacate restricted property after hours, requesting backup. Static crackled for a moment before the dispatcher's voice responded. Copy that, Henderson. Backup en route. ETA 5 minutes. The radio hissed softly as Henderson lowered his hand. He glanced toward Frank, who hadn't flinched at the call for reinforcement. His focus remained entirely on the headstone before him, as though nothing beyond that cold granite existed. You didn't have to call anyone, Frank said quietly, his voice calm but heavy. I'm not causing trouble. I'm not here to break the rules for the sake of it. He closed his eyes and shook his head slightly. I lost track of time. I know you're not trying to cause trouble, sir, Henderson replied, his voice softening. But it's my job to make sure the property is secure after hours. The two men stood in the dim light, separated by far more than distance, one clinging to his last moments of connection, the other bound by duty and regulations. Frank finally exhaled another shaky breath. You're young. You'll understand one day. His voice carried no malice, only weariness. One day you'll stand where I stand, and maybe then you'll wish someone had given you just a few more minutes. Henderson said nothing. The truth of those words settled heavily in the air between them. The distant rumble of tires on gravel signaled the approach of the second patrol car. Blue and red lights flashed in the distance, growing brighter as the vehicle drew closer. Frank's eyes returned once more to his son's grave. I'm sorry, Daniel, he whispered. Looks like I have to go now. As the backup unit arrived and the vehicle door opened, the night's quiet tension held its breath. The soft rumble of engines grew louder, followed by the rhythmic crunch of tires rolling across the cemetery's gravel paths. The flashing blue and red lights bathed the surrounding headstones in eerie, pulsing glow. Two additional patrol cars pulled to a stop near Officer Henderson's cruiser, their headlights cutting sharp beams through the otherwise peaceful night. Frank barely lifted his head at the arrival of the backup. His body felt like lead, weighed down not only by age but by the sheer gravity of grief. His knees ached from hours of standing, the sharp sting of arthritis burning deep within the joints. The emotional toll of the day had hollowed him out, leaving only a fragile shell of the man who had once served his country with unyielding strength. Doors swung open, and two more officers stepped out, both younger than Henderson. Officers Ramirez and Collins exchanged brief nods with Henderson as they approached, taking quick, practiced glances at the scene in front of them. Henderson stepped forward to meet them, keeping his voice low but firm. "Gentlemen, this is Frank Delaney. He's refusing to leave the property after hours. I've informed him of the trespassing violation, but he's not complying." Ramirez glanced over at Frank, who now sat heavily on a nearby stone bench, his shoulders slumped, hands resting limply on his knees. The older man looked more like a grieving grandfather than a threat. "Looks like he's sitting now. What's the issue?" Collins asked in a hushed tone. Henderson kept his gaze steady. "He's been here for hours. When I asked him to leave, he pleaded for more time. I called you guys in because he's still not cooperating. We need to resolve this before it escalates." Ramirez frowned slightly, his instincts tugging at him. But protocol was protocol. Henderson had called for backup, and now the situation had to be handled by the book. Frank closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the officers' muted conversation. He had no energy left to argue, no strength to rise quickly even if he wanted to. His legs throbbed, his back stiffened with sharp spasms. The long day had drained every reserve. Finally, Henderson turned back toward Frank and spoke louder now, his voice edged with authority. "Mr. Delaney, I'm asking you one more time. Please stand and come with us." Frank opened his eyes and exhaled heavily. He placed both hands on the bench, trying to push himself up slowly. His stiff knees resisted at first, forcing him to pause midway, breathing deeply through the pain. The simple act of standing had become a battle. "I'm trying," Frank said, his voice strained but calm. "Just give me a second." From the corner of his eye, Henderson noticed Ramirez and Collins subtly shifting their stances, their bodies instinctively preparing for resistance. The dim light, the graveyard setting, the odd circumstances, it all fed into a heightened sense of caution. As Frank pressed again to rise, his right knee buckled momentarily. His body lurched forward a few inches before he caught himself, steadying with a groan. The stumble was brief, but sudden enough to cause a flicker of alarm in Henderson's mind. "Watch it!" Henderson shouted, instinctively reaching for his belt. In the tense silence, even the smallest movement was magnified. The other two officers reacted instantly, hands moving to their holsters and tasers, eyes locked on Frank. No, I'm fine." Frank rasped, freezing in place as he finally stood upright, breathless and swaying slightly. His hands remained open and empty, held low at his sides. "Just my damn knee." But to Henderson, who was still new enough to the job that split-second decisions felt both terrifying and absolute, the stumble appeared as a possible lunge or preparation for aggression. "Get the taser ready," Henderson ordered sharply, his voice tight with adrenaline. Ramirez drew his taser, but kept it pointed downward for the moment, eyes darting between Frank and Henderson. "Sir, keep your hands where we can see them," he instructed, trying to maintain calm. Frank froze, his chest heaving with heavy breaths, confused and overwhelmed. The flashing lights, the sudden shouting, the sight of weapons being drawn, all of it created a storm of sensory overload. "I'm not resisting," Frank said, his voice breaking under the weight of exhaustion. "Please, I just lost my son today." Collins' eyes softened slightly, but he stayed in position, his training dictating his every move. Henderson, standing closest, kept his hand hovering near his baton as a precaution. The tension in the air thickened. No one spoke for several long seconds. Only the distant chirping of night insects and the occasional crackle of a police radio filled the void. Ramirez glanced quickly at Henderson, his voice low but urgent. "I think he's just exhausted, Kyle. Look at him." Henderson's jaw clenched. His heart was pounding. each beat thudding his ears like distant drum fire. His training emphasized control of the situation, quick assessment of threats, and officer safety above all else. But this wasn't the typical belligerent suspect he had imagined when first learning the protocols. Frank stood there, shoulders hunched, eyes glistening, swaying ever so slightly as his knees trembled beneath him. "Please," Frank whispered again, his voice almost lost the breeze. "I'll go. I just need a moment to steady myself." For a brief instant, Henderson hesitated, tore between protocol and compassion, but his nerves remained taut. He motioned to Ramirez, "Keep the taser ready, just in case." Ramirez nodded but didn't raise the weapon. Collins shifted slightly to the side, blocking any possible movement toward the patrol cars. Frank finally managed to take a half step forward, his movement slow and deliberate, his breathing labored. He wasn't fighting, just struggling with each small action. The momentary surge of tension had passed, but the fragile atmosphere remained on edge, like a wire stretched too tight, ready to snap at the slightest provocation. The standoff lingered in uneasy silence, the moon casting long, sharp shadows across the cemetery as both sides waited for the next moment to unfold. The cemetery remained suspended in a fragile silence, broken only by Frank's heavy breathing and the low murmurs of the officers conferring behind him. The glow from the patrol cars' flashing lights painted the graves in a surreal canvas of blue and red, casting long, shifting shadows that danced eerily over the grass. Frank tried to take another step forward, but his right leg trembled under the strain. His breath came in shallow gasps, chest tightening as the exhaustion of grief, age, and arthritis bore down on him like an invisible weight. He swayed, reaching out instinctively to steady himself against a nearby headstone. Daniel's headstone. To Officer Henderson, already on edge, the sudden movement registered as erratic and unpredictable. His nerves, stretched thin by the tension of the moment, screamed for action. "Sir, stop!" Henderson shouted, his voice sharp. Frank, barely able to comprehend the words, froze in place. I'm trying," he whispered, his voice cracked and hoarse. "I just need—" But Henderson's instincts took over. In his young mind, the blurred line between precaution and overreaction vanished in an instant. His hand shot to his taser, drawing it with a swift motion. Without another word of warning, his fingers squeezed the trigger. A loud pop cracked through the night air, followed immediately by the faint hiss of wires unfurling. The twin prong struck Frank squarely in the chest. For a brief, frozen heartbeat, time stood still. Then the electricity surged through Frank's body, lighting every nerve ending on fire. His muscles seized violently, locking his arms to his sides, his legs rigid and trembling as the voltage pulsed through him. "Ag!" Frank cried out, the sound guttural and raw, echoing across the graveyard like a wounded animal. He collapsed to the ground with a heavy thud, landing partially against his son's headstone. His face twisted in agony as the current continued its merciless assault. His back arched unnaturally before slamming back onto the cold earth. The pain was blinding, far worse than anything Frank had felt since his years on the battlefield. In an instant, old memories burst to the surface. He was no longer in Evergreen Memorial Cemetery. He was in the humid jungles of a distant country, gunfire rattling through the trees, the sharp metallic scent of blood thick in the air. His squad was under heavy fire. Explosions shook the earth beneath them. Then came the searing pain, shrapnel ripping through his leg and shoulder, throwing him to the ground. Frank heard his comrades shouting, their voices distant yet urgent. "Delaney's down! Cover fire! Get him out of here!" Strong arms had lifted him then, dragging his battered body across the mud-soaked terrain, while bullets whizzed overhead. His world blurred between flashes of excruciating pain and the determined faces of his brothers in arms. Now, decades later, the taser's electricity forced him to relive every one of those moments with cruel clarity. His screams mixed with the cries that had once escaped his lips on the battlefield, his mind trapped in an agonizing loop of past and present. The officer stood frozen for a moment, stunned by the sudden intensity of Frank's reaction. "Cut the taser!" Ramirez barked. Henderson released the trigger, and the voltage stopped. Frank's body jerked once more before going limp, his chest heaving in desperate, shallow gasps. His face was pale, glistening with cold sweat, his eyes wide and unseeing as he lay partially draped across Daniel's grave. Collins and Ramirez rushed forward. Sir, can you hear me? Ramirez knelt beside Frank, his voice urgent but careful. Frank's lips trembled as he struggled to speak, his mind still wrestling with the remnants of his flashback. His breaths came in short, panicked bursts, every muscle in his body still twitching from the residual shock. My son, he whispered, his voice barely audible. Don't leave my son. The anguish in his voice pierced even the officer's professional detachment. Collins quickly checked his pulse, feeling the rapid, erratic beat under his fingertips. He's tachycardic. Get EMS now. Collins shouted toward Henderson, who stood a few feet away, his face pale, eyes wide with the realization of what he'd just done. Henderson stumbled back to his radio, voice shaking as he called dispatch. Dispatch, Evergreen Memorial. Officer involved, taser deployment. Subject is down. Medical needed immediately. The response crackled back almost instantly. Copy that. EMS en route. ETA 5 minutes. Around them, lights from nearby streets flickered as a few late-night passers-by slowed their cars, drawn by the flashing patrol lights and the sight of officers clustered near the gravestones. A small group of distant onlookers had gathered near the cemetery gates, murmuring among themselves as the chaotic scene unfolded. Frank's cries of pain had echoed far beyond the perimeter, drawing attention even from neighboring homes whose porch lights now blinked on one by one. Ramirez stayed by Frank's side, speaking in calm, steady tones. Stay with me, Mr. Delaney. Help is on the way. Just breathe. Frank's eyes fluttered as the world around him continued to blur and spin. The electric pain had subsided, but in its place was a hollow, gnawing ache that radiated from deep within his chest. His hand, trembling, reached once more toward his son's headstone, fingers barely grazing the cold marble. My boy, he murmured again, tears slipping from the corners of his eyes. Collins glanced back at Henderson, his voice sharp. What were you thinking, man? He wasn't a threat. Henderson opened his mouth, but no words came. His heart pounded in his chest as guilt gnawed at him, the magnitude of his actions settling like a stone in his stomach. The sirens of the approaching ambulance pierced the night air, drawing closer with every passing second, while Frank lay motionless on the ground, half in the present, half trapped in ghosts of wars long past. The graveyard once again fell into a tense, uneasy stillness. The wail of the approaching ambulance faded into the distance as medical personnel lifted Frank onto a stretcher and transported him to the waiting vehicle. The cemetery, now scattered with flashing lights, anxious whispers, and growing crowds, settled into an uneasy quiet. The officers remained behind, speaking in hushed tones, their faces tense under the weight of what had just transpired. Across the street, inside a small corner store illuminated by flickering fluorescent lights, Mrs. Alvarez stood frozen behind the counter. The elderly shopkeeper had watched the entire scene unfold from her front window, her hand pressed tightly against her chest as her eyes welled with tears. For months, she had seen Frank Delaney walk past her store every morning. He always carried the same bouquet of fresh flowers, always headed for Evergreen Memorial. Rain or shine, Frank made his pilgrimage to his son's grave without fail. She knew his face well, the quiet dignity in his eyes, the slow, deliberate steps of a man carrying the invisible burden of grief. But tonight, that quiet dignity had been shattered before her very eyes. Her heart pounded as she fumbled for her cell phone resting on the counter. Her fingers shook, but muscle memory guided her as she scrolled a familiar contact name. Marcus Rivera. Lance Corporal Marcus Rivera answered on the second ring. His voice came through the speaker, cheerful and relaxed. Mrs. Alvarez? Everything okay? No, Mijo. No, it's not okay, she said, her voice tight with urgency. It's Mr. Delaney. They arrested him at the cemetery. They tossed him. I saw it all from my shop. It was horrible. Marcus's tone immediately shifted, his words sharp and alert. Wait, what? They did what to Frank? They took him away in an ambulance just now, Mrs. Alvarez continued, her voice breaking slightly. He was just visiting his son's grave, like always. But the police, they treated him like a criminal. Marcus felt his jaw clench as a surge of anger flared in his chest. Frank Delaney wasn't just some old man in town. He was a legend to every young Marine in their local VFW chapter. The retired master gunnery sergeant had spent decades serving his country, guiding generations of soldiers, including Marcus himself. "I'm on my way," Marcus said firmly. "Stay inside, Mrs. Alvarez. I'll handle this." He ended the call and immediately dialed his fellow Marines. One by one, they answered, each voice tense with concern as Marcus explained what happened. No further explanation was needed. Within minutes, they were all mobilizing. By the time Marcus arrived at the cemetery's main gate, his fellow Marines were pulling up alongside him. 7 of them in total, all in full dress blues, polished metals glinting under the streetlights. The gravity of their attire matched the seriousness in their eyes. There was Corporal Jensen, tall and broad-shouldered, Sergeant Lou, quiet but fiercely loyal, Corporal Diaz, eyes burning with indignation, Staff Sergeant Morales, always calm under pressure, Lance Corporal Singh, who had lost his own father last year, Sergeant Thomas, the steady one who rarely spoke but always acted, and Private First Class Bennett, the youngest but no less committed. Marcus looked each of them in the eye. "We don't cause trouble," he said firmly. "We don't escalate. We just stand with our brother. Master Gunnery Sergeant Delaney stood for us. Now we stand for him." Each Marine nodded, the unspoken bond between them stronger than any words could express. As they made their way through the cemetery gate, the scene grew tense. The remaining officers glanced up, instantly aware of the imposing presence of 7 Marines advancing in synchronized precision. The small group of gathered onlookers whispered among themselves, sensing the solemn energy in the air. Officer Ramirez stepped forward cautiously. "Gentlemen, this is a police matter." "We're not here to interfere," Marcus replied, his tone calm but firm. "We're here for our master gunnery sergeant. He's family." Officer Henderson stood behind Ramirez, his face pale, his gaze dropping under the weight of their stern eyes. He could feel their silent judgment slicing through him. He hadn't just tossed an elderly man, he had tossed a Marine legend, and now his brothers had come. Mrs. Alvarez, who had stepped outside her shop despite Marcus's warning, clasped her hands together as she watched the young Marines arrive. The sight of them, disciplined, united, and respectful, sent a wave of both pride and sorrow through her heart. "Dios los bendiga," she whispered under her breath. The Marines moved past the officers without another word and approached Daniel Delaney's grave, the place where Frank had collapsed earlier. The grass was still disturbed where the stretcher had been lifted, and a small bouquet of flowers lay scattered beside the headstone, trampled during the chaos. Marcus knelt down gently, gathering the crushed flowers and placing them neatly back at the base of the headstone. His fingers lingered on the marble surface for a moment. He read the inscription silently. "Daniel J. Delaney, asterisk beloved son, proud Marine, asterisk, Semper Fi." A heavy silence settled over the group as they stood in formation, heads bowed. Their quiet presence spoke volumes, a living shield of respect around Frank's son's grave, and by extension, Frank himself. Behind them, more onlookers gathered, some filming the scene on their phones, others simply observing the unfolding moment of quiet defiance. Word of what had happened was spreading fast, carried by whispers, texts, and social media posts. The community was waking up. Inside his patrol car, Henderson gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. The realization of what he had set into motion gnawed at him. The silence of Marines was far more damning than any shouted protest. Ramirez lowered his voice and spoke to Collins nearby. "They're not here to fight. They're here to remind everyone who that man is." Collins nodded gravely. "And they're doing a damn good job of it." The night air was cool, carried with it the faint scent of fresh-cut grass and distant rain. The cemetery lights flickered overhead as the Marines stood their quiet vigil, waiting, loyal and unyielding. They would not leave until their brother returned. The night air grew heavier as the 7 Marines, dressed in immaculate blues, advanced in perfect unison toward the cluster of officers. The faint metallic clink of their polished metals echoed with each synchronized step. Even in the low glow of the cemetery's lights, The gleam of their brass buttons and insignias stood out, a quiet testament to the discipline they embodied. Every movement was deliberate, measured, and calm. They were not storming the scene. They were not here to escalate. They were here to restore balance. Officer Henderson instinctively took a step back as they approached, his mouth suddenly dry. The authority he had felt only moments ago evaporated beneath the collective weight of their silent presence. The steady, focused gazes of the Marines locked onto him, not with aggression, but with something far more unnerving, profound disappointment. Marcus Rivera, slightly ahead of the formation, slowed to a stop a few feet from the officers. His voice, when it came, was calm but carried an unmistakable authority earned from years of discipline. "Good evening, officers," he began, nodding slightly. "I'm Lance Corporal Marcus Rivera. These men are my fellow Marines." Officer Ramirez cleared his throat, trying to steady his own nerves. "Evening," he responded politely, attempting to maintain composure. Marcus continued, his tone respectful but firm. "We're here on behalf of Master Gunnery Sergeant Frank Delaney." He paused, letting the name hang in the air like a stone dropped into still water. The nearby crowd, growing by the minute, leaned in to listen. "Can you please confirm exactly why he was detained and what justified the level of force that was used on him?" Marcus asked evenly, his hands clasped behind his back in parade rest. Officer Henderson swallowed hard. His mind scrambled for the right words. This wasn't a routine encounter anymore. The presence of the Marines had transformed it into something far weightier, a public reckoning. He was trespassing after hours," Henderson stammered. "The cemetery closed at sundown." Marcus nodded slowly, absorbing the response without interruption. "And was he violent, threatening, aggressive in any way?" Marcus asked, his voice steady. Henderson shifted uncomfortably. "Well, no, but he was refusing to leave when asked. He was non-compliant." Marcus's expression remained neutral, but his eyes sharpened. Non-compliant because he was grieving at his son's grave, a son who, like us, served his country. Ramirez stepped in, sensing Henderson's growing unease. "We understand emotions were high," Ramirez offered. Officer Henderson followed protocol to de-escalate, but things unfortunately got out of hand. Marcus took a moment before responding. His voice dropped slightly, drawing attention to every word. "Respectfully, Sergeant Ramirez, de-escalation does not involve tossing a 68-year-old veteran kneeling at his child's headstone. That's not de-escalation." The surrounding crowd murmured quietly, their voices filled with agreement. Several civilians had started recording with their phones. The soft glow of screens illuminated the scene from multiple angles. Marcus took a step closer, remaining entirely within the bounds of professionalism, but making his presence unmistakably felt. "I'd like to request Master Gunnery Sergeant Delaney's personal effects," Marcus said, "including his identification, which I assume is in your possession." Ramirez hesitated, but sensing the growing tension and the optics of the situation, he motioned to Collins. "Retrieve Mr. Delaney's wallet." Collins nodded and approached one of the squad cars, opening the passenger door and pulling out a small, neatly folded plastic evidence bag. Inside was Frank's wallet and a few other belongings collected when he was taken to the hospital. Collins handed the bag to Ramirez, who then extended it toward Marcus. Marcus received it respectfully. He carefully unzipped the bag and removed Frank's military ID, holding it up as he read it aloud. "Master Gunnery Sergeant Frank Delaney, United States Marine Corps, retired." The name and rank carried weight. More than simple words on plastic, it was a living testament to decades of sacrifice, discipline, and honor. Every Marine standing behind Marcus subtly straightened their posture at the sound of it. Marcus returned the ID to the wallet, then looked Henderson directly in the eye. "Officer, you toss a man who's given more to this country than most could imagine, a man who lost his son in service, and now visits his grave to honor him. Do you understand the gravity of that?" Henderson struggled to maintain eye contact. His voice was small, almost offensive. I was just following procedure." Marcus's voice remained even, but a sharpened edge crept in. "Procedure exists to serve justice, not abandon common sense or compassion." The other Marines behind him remained silent, statuesque in their bearing, but the atmosphere they created was palpable. They weren't here for theatrics or intimidation. They were here to remind everyone what honor, loyalty, and brotherhood meant. Ramirez took a deep breath, attempting to salvage what dignity remained. "We'll make sure this incident is fully reviewed," he said carefully. "For now, Mr. Delaney is receiving medical care. If you gentlemen would like to be informed of his condition—" "We would," Marcus interrupted politely but firmly, "and we'll remain here until we have confirmation." Mrs. Alvarez, still watching from across the street, clasped her rosary tightly, whispering prayers under her breath. Tears filled her eyes, not from fear, but from pride. These young Marines represented something far bigger than any one of them. They represented the unbreakable bond that existed long after the uniform was folded away. More members of the community continued to arrive, some bringing coffee and blankets, others simply standing in silent solidarity. The cemetery, once the scene of violence and misunderstanding, now transformed into a symbol of quiet resilience and unity. Even Henderson, in his growing discomfort, couldn't deny the shift in atmosphere. The power dynamic had changed entirely, not through force or confrontation, but through discipline, respect, and the silent strength of brotherhood. The Marines stood tall under the moonlight, their calm intervention reframing the entire incident. They hadn't shouted. They hadn't threatened. They hadn't needed to. Their very presence spoke for itself. The quiet hum of conversation rippled through the crowd like a current as more neighbors, friends, and curious onlookers gathered near the cemetery gates. The glow of cell phone screens shimmered like fireflies in the dim light, capturing every moment as the scene continued to unfold. The 7 Marines now stood in a protective circle around Frank, who sat on a portable stretcher that paramedics had brought in. Though his breathing was steady, his face remained pale, etched with pain both physical and emotional. His body bore the sting of the taser, but his eyes, those tired, grief-stricken eyes, never strayed far from his son's headstone a few feet away. Lance Corporal Marcus Rivera maintained his calm, watchful stance at Frank's side. His brothers stood beside him, silent, disciplined sentinels who had taken their places without needing direction. Their presence formed a living shield, not one of hostility, but of solemn honor. The civilians surrounding the scene murmured quietly. Some shook their heads, others whispered indignantly, and many continued recording. The entire town was watching now. What had started as a simple confrontation had grown into something far larger. Flashing blue lights painted the surrounding trees as more emergency personnel arrived. Among them, a black sedan pulled up along the cemetery service road, and from it stepped an older man in a dark suit, Mr. Leonard Chambers, the director of Evergreen Memorial Cemetery. His silver hair gleamed under the streetlights, and he walked briskly toward the officers, his expression stern. "Director Chambers," Officer Ramirez greeted, attempting to maintain professionalism as Chambers approached. "What is going on here?" Chambers asked sharply, glancing around the officers, the Marines, and the gathered crowd. His eyes finally landed on Frank, and a deep crease formed across his brow. "Why is Master Gunnery Sergeant Delaney restrained? What happened to him?" Ramirez shifted uncomfortably. "There was a situation, sir. Officer Henderson here," he gestured, attempted to enforce cemetery closing hours. Mr. Delaney was non-compliant. Chambers' face darkened, his voice rising with frustration. "Non-compliant," he repeated. "Frank Delaney has my personal authorization to remain here after hours. He's grieving the loss of his son, Private First Class Aaron Delaney, who was laid to rest right here this morning." The words cut through the air like a blade. The murmurs among the crowd grew louder, more agitated. Several gasps rippled from those closest to the scene. Henderson's face flushed crimson as the weight of Chambers' words landed. I wasn't informed of any authorization," Henderson stammered, trying to steady his voice. There was no notice posted at the gate. Chambers narrowed his eyes. "Because it was a private arrangement. The family was grieving, and I personally told Mr. Delaney he could stay as long as he needed following the service. My staff was informed. If you had simply made a call confirm instead of escalating, this entire situation could have been avoided." The Marine stood motionless, but the slight tightening of their jaws revealed their growing disapproval. Marcus, still composed, took a breath and spoke again, his voice unwavering. "Director Chambers, thank you for clarifying. That explains why Master Gunnery Sergeant Delaney was here, and it makes Officer Henderson's use of force entirely unjustified." The cameras shifted, zooming in on Chambers as his words continued to hang in the humid night air. The tension that had gripped the cemetery now shifted further, away from Frank and onto Henderson. Henderson, standing stiff and pale, looked to Ramirez for support, but none came. Even Ramirez struggled to meet his gaze now. The young rookie officer could feel the crowd's judgment surrounding him, pressing in from all directions. Chambers turned back toward the officers, his voice firm but controlled. "I will be filing a full report with the city. This behavior is unacceptable, especially to a man who has already paid more than his fair share in service to this country." The crowd's murmurs turned into quiet applause, the soft clapping growing gradually louder as more civilians expressed their solidarity with Frank. Frank, still sitting quietly on the stretcher, managed to lift his head and offer a faint nod of appreciation toward Chambers. His voice, though weak, found strength enough to whisper, "Thank you." One of the paramedics gently touched Frank's shoulder. "Sir, we need to take you in for evaluation." Frank nodded faintly, though his eyes drifted back to his son's grave once more. The Marines allowed the paramedics through, maintaining their protective perimeter as Frank was carefully lifted and secured into the waiting ambulance. As the paramedics worked, Marcus addressed the officers one final time. "For the record, everything that happened tonight is being documented, not just by these good people," he gestured to the filming crowd, "but by us as well." The other Marines gave a subtle nod. Even without cameras, their witness held weight. Years of discipline, duty, and honor woven into their testimonies. Ramirez finally spoke again, his voice quiet but resigned. "We'll ensure a full review is conducted." Chambers crossed his arms. "See that you do, and I expect you'll be answering for more than just poor judgment." The applause continued as the ambulance pulled away slowly, its red lights fading into the distance. The Marines stood silently, their duty not yet finished, their loyalty unwavering. As the crowd slowly began dispersing, Mrs. Alvarez approached Marcus, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Mijo. You boys showed real dignity tonight. Frank deserved better than what he was given." Marcus offered her a gentle smile. "We take care of our own, ma'am. Always." Underneath the starlit sky, the cemetery returned to a strange, quiet stillness. The headstones stood like sentinels, witnesses of both sorrow and resilience. And amid it all, the Marines remained, shoulders squared, back straight, a silent reminder of what brotherhood truly meant. The distant sound of squealing tires broke the momentary silence as another police vehicle sped through the cemetery gates. Its headlights swept across the rows of headstones, illuminating the somber faces of Marines still standing firm. The crowd, though starting to thin, paused once again as the car came to a halt and the door flung open. Out stepped Captain Laura Bennett, the precinct supervisor, a woman in her early 40s, sharp-eyed, composed, but visibly concerned. She strode purposefully toward the cluster of officers, her badge gleaming under the streetlights. The tension in the air thickened as everyone watched her approach. Ramirez greeted her with a quiet nod. Henderson, on the other hand, straightened up abruptly, trying to mask the anxiety gripping him. "Captain," Ramirez began, "there's been an—" Bennett raised a hand, silencing him. Her eyes swept over the scene. The crowd, the Marines, the paramedics, and finally Frank, who sat on the stretcher, visibly shaken but conscious. Then she turned to Officer Henderson, her gaze sharp as a scalpel. "Officer Henderson, explain yourself," she ordered. Henderson's voice trembled as he attempted to justify his actions. "Ma'am, I arrived to find Mr. Delaney trespassing after hours. He refused to comply with my orders to leave. I gave him multiple warnings, but he remained non-compliant. I was forced to escalate for my safety." "For your safety?" Bennett repeated, her tone icy. "Against a grieving, elderly veteran sitting at his son's grave?" The captain turned to Chambers, who had remained nearby, arms crossed. "Director Chambers, Is it true Mr. Delaney had permission to be here? Yes, Captain. Chambers confirmed without hesitation. I granted him special permission earlier today. His son was laid to rest this morning. This was supposed to be a private moment of grief, not a scene for law enforcement. The captain closed her eyes for a brief moment, exhaling sharply. The truth was glaring. The escalation had been unnecessary, reckless, and deeply inappropriate. She addressed Ramirez. Why wasn't this verified before force was used? Ramirez shifted uncomfortably. I arrived after the taser deployment. Captain, I wasn't aware of the prior arrangements until Director Chambers arrived. Bennett's jaw tightened. She turned back to Henderson, her voice steady but firm. Officer Henderson, your conduct tonight was unacceptable and an embarrassment to this department. You failed to perform a basic verification before escalating to physical force. Worse, you exercised poor judgment in dealing with a bereaved veteran. You're hereby relieved of duty pending an immediate internal investigation. Gasps echoed through the remaining crowd. Henderson's face drained to color, his shoulders sagging as the reality of her words sank in. Captain, please. He tried to protest. Enough, Bennett snapped. Remove your badge and firearm. With trembling hands, Henderson unclipped his badge and weapon, surrendering them to Ramirez, who accepted them solemnly. The former officer stood there, defeated, as murmurs of approval rippled through the onlookers. Turning her attention back to Frank, Bennett softened her tone. She approached slowly, kneeling slightly to meet his gaze. Master Gunnery Sergeant Delaney, I sincerely apologize for what you endured tonight. This was a grave mistake. Effective immediately, all charges are dropped and you are free to go. Frank, his breathing still labored, offered a small nod. His voice was raspy but steady. I only wanted to say goodbye. Bennett's eyes glistened with restrained emotion. And you will, sir, without interference. She gestured to the officers, standing nearby. Uncuff him. The officers moved quickly, releasing Frank from the restraints. As the metal cuffs clicked open, Marcus and two other Marines immediately stepped forward, gently helping Frank rise to his feet. Their hands were steady, their movements respectful, as if handling a fallen brother. Frank stood, though his legs wobbled slightly under the weight of exhaustion and grief. His eyes drifted toward the headstone once more. The Marines repositioned themselves behind him, standing at attention, their dress blues immaculate under the soft moonlight. The onlookers grew silent, many lowering their phones now, sensing the sanctity of the moment returning. Frank slowly shuffled forward, each step deliberate. He knelt carefully before the grave of his son, tracing his fingertips along the etched letters of Aaron's name. The cool granite offered no comfort, but the connection was undeniable. I'm sorry, son, Frank whispered, his voice barely audible. I'm sorry this turned into such a mess. I just wanted to be with you a little longer. The wind carried his words into the night, mingling them with the faint rustling of leaves. A heavy stillness settled over the cemetery as the Marines behind him remained statuesque, silent guardians paying respect to both father and son. Tears welled in Frank's eyes as he placed a small, worn photograph beside the headstone, a photo of Aaron in uniform, smiling proudly during his basic training graduation. The simple gesture said more than words ever could. As Frank lingered for a moment longer, one of the Marines gently stepped forward. Whenever you're ready, sir, we've got you. Frank inhaled deeply, steadying himself, and then slowly stood with the Marine support. His hand briefly rested on the headstone one final time before turning away. The crowd, though solemn, began softly applauding again, a respectful gesture, honoring not just Frank's personal loss, but his dignity reclaimed in the face of injustice. Captain Bennett watched quietly, her expression serious but respectful. She approached Marcus, offering a firm handshake. Thank you, Corporal Rivera. You and your men handled this with remarkable professionalism. Just doing what we were taught, ma'am, Marcus replied. We take care of our own. The ambulance stood ready nearby, its doors open in case Frank needed further medical care. But for now, he chose to walk, supported by the strong arms of his fellow Marines. The moon cast a silvery glow across the cemetery grounds as the group made their slow procession toward the exit. Behind them, Aaron's headstone stood tall, a silent witness to a father's grief, a community's outrage, and the quiet strength that ultimately restored dignity where it had been stripped away. The world had watched. Within hours of that night at Evergreen Memorial Cemetery, footage captured by dozens of bystanders flooded social media. News outlets quickly picked up the story. Asterisk retired Marine Taz while Morning Sun sparks national outrage. Asterisk the hashtags multiplied, and debates raged across television panels and online forums. Some argued about law enforcement protocols. Others focused on the sanctity of grief and the right to mourn without harassment. But one message cut through all the noise and political posturing: respect for veterans and the brotherhood that refused to let one man suffer alone. Frank Delaney had never wanted any of it. He never asked to become a symbol. But now, 3 weeks later, the ripples continue to spread far beyond his quiet town. Each morning, his mailbox overflowed. Handwritten notes, care packages, folded American flags sent from strangers, cards with simple messages like, "You're not alone, Marine," or asterisk, "Semper Fi, brother." Asterisk emails poured in from around the country, even from overseas bases where active duty Marines followed the story with clenched jaws and quiet pride. Fellow veterans share their own struggles, stories of loneliness, loss, and pain, and offered words of solidarity. Civilians, too, expressed their gratitude for his service, for his son's sacrifice, and for the dignity with which Frank had carried himself through such a harrowing ordeal. Each evening, Frank sat at his modest kitchen table, reading every letter slowly, sometimes twice. Many brought tears. Some brought comfort. All carried a weight he never expected. A reminder that even in his darkest hours, people still cared. Among the hundreds, 7 letters stood out. They came from the 7 Marines who had arrived that night, each one written in careful penmanship, as if the weight of the moment demanded nothing less. In their words, they spoke not only of duty but of honor, how standing by Frank was not just a right thing, but the only thing their hearts allowed. Marcus Rivera's letter was the first Frank read. "Sir," it began, asterisk, "I will never forget the look on your face that night. The strength you showed, even under such disrespect, reminded me why I wear this uniform. We may not share blood, but we are family. Semper Fi, Master Gunnery Sergeant." Asterisk, the others echoed the same sentiment. Simple, honest, full of respect. Today, Frank carried those 7 letters carefully in his hand as he returned once more to Evergreen Memorial. The early afternoon sun filtered through the swaying trees, casting long shadows across the rows of white markers. A gentle breeze rustled the flags that stood firmly planted beside many of the headstones. The familiar path to Aaron's grave felt different today. The weight of sorrow still clung to his heart, but it was accompanied by something else, an invisible embrace from brothers he never expected, strangers who had stood between him and injustice simply because it was the right thing to do. He paused as he reached Aaron's resting place. The granite headstone gleamed softly under the sunlight, still adorned with a small photograph Frank had left weeks earlier. A fresh arrangement of flowers rested at its base, placed earlier that morning by someone who likely wanted to pay quiet respects. Frank knelt down slowly, his knees protesting slightly from age and wear, but his hands steady as he placed the 7 letters beside the photograph. The wind threatened to lift them, but he anchored them gently beneath a small stone. "You got good men watching over you, son," Frank whispered. His voice was steady, filled with a deep well of pride that only fathers truly understood. "They stood tall for me when I couldn't stand for myself. That's the kind of men you always wanted to be around." He let the silence settle, feeling the warmth of the sun on his shoulders, the calm of the cemetery enveloping him like a familiar blanket. "I miss you, Aaron," he continued softly. "Not a day goes by. But I want you to know your brothers are still out there. They remind me that honor isn't just a word they print on recruiting posters. It's real, it's alive, and it lives on even when everything else feels lost." A single tear traced down his cheek, glistening in the afternoon light. He made no effort to wipe it away. Behind him, distant footsteps crunched gently along the gravel path. Frank didn't need to turn around to know who they belonged to. The 7 Marines stood back respectfully, having arrived silently, as if summoned by nothing more than brotherhood itself. They remained at a distance, standing tall in their dress blues, hands clasped behind their backs, eyes forward. They offered no words, for none were needed. Frank glanced back, offering them a firm nod of gratitude. Marcus nodded in return, his face solemn yet filled with quiet pride. The unspoken bond between them transcended words, formed not from shared blood, but from shared values, loyalty, sacrifice, and unbreakable honor. As the wind carried the faint sounds of rustling leaves, Frank allowed himself a rare smile. In the weeks following that painful night, the world had debated authority, policy, and justice. Politicians had argued. Commentators had speculated. But here, in this sacred place, only one truth remained. Brotherhood never ends. The Marine stayed at silent attention as Frank took one final glance at Aaron's grave, whispering his last words for the day. Rest easy, son. You're not forgotten. Slowly, with the dignity of a man who had once led others into battle and who had faced far worse than ignorance and injustice, Frank rose to his feet. As he walked past the Marines, each one offered a sharp salute. Frank paused, returned their salutes with practiced precision, and spoke the words that bound them all together. Semper Fi, Marines. Semper Fi, Master Gunnery Sergeant. They answered in unison. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long, golden beams across the field of headstones. And as Frank walked toward the exit, flanked once again by the silent guardians of his grief and his honor, one truth rang clearer than ever. No veteran ever truly stands alone.